Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm very excited to be part of this virtual SCEC meeting experiment. In this talk, I will present some ideas for how to accelerate research into earthquake precursors. In particular, I will argue that we need to rethink our research methodology. I think we all know that seismology has a history of failed earthquake precursor research. This led some to conclude that earthquakes cannot be predicted. And in 2009, Sue Huff wrote this wonderful book about the history of earthquake prediction, and it's really worth a read. In 2011, the International Commission on Earthquake Forecasting just reiterated that there are currently no reliable earthquake precursors prior to impending large earthquakes. So that's the status as of 2011. So you might ask, what's new? Why are we here today and have a session on this at the SCEC annual meeting? Well, the Tohoku and Iquique earthquakes happened, where some people claim that there was a simultaneous occurrence of seismic, geodetic, and perhaps gravitational precursors, which led some to optimism about the recurrence of such precursors prior to future earthquakes. Secondly, machine learning is now able to predict earthquakes in the lab. Thirdly, B-value variations have been mapped to correlate systematically with the occurrence of subsequent larger earthquakes. And finally, and at least in this selection, several studies have now shown that there's a localization of seismicity prior to impending larger earthquakes in California. Two of these will be discussed in more detail in subsequent talks, by Ilya and Emily. What I would like to focus on is a broader question. So coming back to the question of what is the potential of earthquake precursors? Again, there's no credible evidence for reliable precursors prior to large earthquakes at this time. I think that's my view and the view of most of the community. But there is much intriguing and empirical and theoretical research. So how do we make progress? According to some, what we need is more data. According to others, what we need are better physical models. And according to others yet, we need more analysis techniques and lab experiments. And I think all three views are represented by the panelists in today's session. The question I would like to ask is whether this is enough. As challenging as it seems, I personally don't think this is enough, and I'll go into that now. So if we look at the failures that have been in earthquake prediction research, we can sort of group the issues into broadly three categories. The first is non-reproducibility, so the inability to obtain the same quantitative results with the same input data and the same method. The second is non-replicability, so the inability to form the same conclusion on the basis of different data sets. And the third one, I think, is the premature and often unskilled communication with the non-scientific community in real time. I won't really talk more about the third one, and I'd just like to say that there's agencies that can do that for us, so we don't need to, and they're quite skilled at that. So focusing on non-reproducibilities, some of the issues are that in the past, predictions and forecasts were vague and imprecise, meaning that we had to interpret them in order to evaluate them. The validation data were specified ambiguously. So for instance, the magnitude scale wasn't defined. The data could be selected post hoc to fit the predictions, etc. Software and data were rarely open source, making it difficult to verify the methods. There were problems due to the real-time nature of data and predictions. And importantly, the peer review process is clearly insufficient for ensuring reproducibility of some of those studies. Moving on to non-replicability, in some cases, algorithms and parameters were adjusted for the next precursor study, and so they became moving targets, which makes them very difficult to evaluate independently. There's a lack of a strong null hypothesis, in particular the time-independent Poisson model is often used as a null hypothesis, and yet we all know that earthquakes cluster in space and in time. Now, in retrospective studies, there are at least two sources of biased results. Firstly, if you search for significance retrospectively, well, you're almost guaranteed to find it. That's also sometimes called p-value hacking or p-hacking in other fields. And finally, I think we all feel the pressures to publish novel and exciting results. And so especially for retrospective studies here, there's a very normal human bias towards commenting only on those exciting results. So grouped in these categories, I think we see that these are not just issues that are specific to seismology. In fact, they are common or somewhat common across the sciences, as has been pointed out in a number of recent articles and studies over the last decade or so. But those also are good news because we can draw on the progress in other disciplines to strengthen our research methodology. There's a new report by the National Academy on the reproducibility and replicability crisis in science. They have many recommendations. I highly recommend reading this report. I won't go through them in detail here, but there's lots of good recommendations for increasing transparency and clarity, for open repositories for data, software, and analysis reports, and to train research in statistical inferences. They also have some recommendations for journals, data management plans, and funders. Just want to point out two particular points here. One is a very clear differentiation between what the Center of Open Science calls exploratory research and confirmatory research. Exploratory research is useful for generating hypotheses, for finding new discoveries. These results, they say, deserve to be replicated and confirmed. They minimize false negatives in order to make discoveries. The p-values lose diagnostic meaning. It's a really important point. And they're not useful for making inferences to wider populations. This can be contrasted with confirmatory research, which is all about hypothesis testing. These results are held to the highest standards. They should be designed to minimize false positive. And here, the p-values retain their diagnostic meaning, and the inferences can be drawn to a wider population. And I'd like to challenge all of you, as you listen to the subsequent presentations, to decide whether these are instances of exploratory research or confirmatory research, and test whether statistical inferences were applied correctly or not. That's a challenge. The other thing I want to point out is, as you might be well aware now, 6 months into the COVID-19 pandemic, that clinical trials and in the biomedical sciences, pre-registration of research plans and research methods is by now common practice. So the idea is that you register the research questions and the analysis plan before you observe the research outcomes in order to avoid very ordinary biases in human reasoning, including hindsight bias. Okay, so with these things in mind, let's come back to the question, what's the potential of earthquake precursors? So in particular, is it enough to just have more data, better models, more analysis techniques and lab experiments? I would argue that we're not even at the stage yet where we know how to assess the potential of earthquake precursors, because most of the research that's been conducted has been of the exploratory form. So what we actually need, in addition to more data and better models and analysis, are empirically testable models, and we need to improve our research methodology and our experimental design. Now, luckily, the Collaboratory for the Study of Earthquake Predictability is a global community of earthquake researchers that are committed to reproducible prospective evaluations of prediction algorithms and forecast models. In particular, we provide a brand new toolkit and an infrastructure for conducting retrospective and prospective earthquake forecasting experiments. I think CSIP can be and should be extended to assist community efforts in designing and conducting precursor experiments. We can help access competitive benchmarks that include clustering. We can help select appropriate performance metrics, perform prospective testing, and archive timestamp predictions, datasets, and software. So the challenge to us and you all is you've got a hypothesis, find some friends, and let's test. Just a brief plug for our brand new software. Go see Bill Sabrin's poster in the EFP category and attend this talk on session 7 on Wednesday morning. So in conclusion, advancing precursor research will require an overhaul of research methodology in addition to more data and better models. To accelerate precursor research, we should pre-register algorithms and hypotheses prior to data collection. We can improve reproducibility via open data, software, and predictions. We should evaluate hypotheses prospectively, so in real time, or with an automated time lag that gets us out of the real-time data issues. And we should be comparing with better benchmarks. So what I'm proposing is that we start community experiments in regions where we have data and competing hypotheses on some of the precursors that will be proposed in this session and elsewhere. Thank you for your time.